This goes against everything I believe in. Can we change this? Maybe? So this might sound blasphemous, and I'm sorry, I don't mean it to. I just don't know another way to phrase it. But I didn't go up going to church. I didn't grow up going to church, and I wasn't religiously affiliated in any way. I didn't know who Jesus was. So until about the age of 10, Batman was my Jesus. I loved Batman. I worshipped Batman. I was obsessed with Batman. Even today, I love Batman. Not as much, but I love Batman. There's not a Batman movie that I don't love. And that's not to say every Batman movie's good or watchable, but I love Batman. My love for Batman runs so deep that it doesn't matter who puts on the cowl. I will love Batman. Sometimes it's harder than others. My love endures. If we could get this. So, loving Batman. I was obsessed with Batman, and my obsession and love was founded on the fundamental truth that one day I would grow up and become the Caped Crusader himself. One day, I would be Batman.
Yes.
Sorry for the pause. I had to wait till the theme song finished playing in my head. So now that you know just how much I loved Batman, you'll understand just how utterly heartbreaking it was the day I realized I could never be Batman. And it wasn't because I wasn't rich, and it wasn't because I lived in Gotham or was the size of 3 Batmans, and it wasn't because, he's fictional. I realized I couldn't be Batman because I have an underbite that you could park 3 Batmobiles in. Meaning, I couldn't be Batman if I had the chin of Jay Leno. That was a tragic epiphany. But I think about stuff like that often and other weird things. But I think about thoughts like that because thoughts like that are funny and they're fascinating and they're powerful, aren't they? How we can think something is true so much so that it holds us back. It stops us from moving forward, whether it's true or not. Or how we can elevate something in our eyes so much so that it stops us from seeing what God is doing in our lives. That is powerful stuff. And both of them have played out in my life dramatically. When he was 24 years old, Vincent van Gogh, or as I'm told his name is pronounced, Van Gogh. Anyway, him. When he was 24, he wanted to be a pastor. This is true. And so, he moved in with his theologian uncle, who was well respected at the time. And he started studying to go to a seminary at the University of Amsterdam. And he studied for his entrance exam, which he failed. And but he was undeterred. And so he enrolled in a 3-month course at a missionary school, and he learned to be a missionary. And so at the age of 26, Vincent van Gogh moved to the south of Belgium to an impoverished coal mining area, and he got a job at a church as a missionary. He worked under priests, and he'd served his community. This is all true. And now Vincent van Gogh, he came from a well-to-do family, meaning that he could afford to rent the nicer bakery. That's incorrect. He could afford to rent the nicer apartment beside the bakery in his town. Damn Wikipedia. And so he lived in this nice apartment beside a bakery. Fact. But Vincent's faith was such that it did not sit right with him to be living in relative luxury, while those in his congregation, those he was serving, his friends, were poor or hungry or had no home to speak of. So Vincent continued to rent his apartment, but he moved out, and those who lived outdoors, the homeless and the poor, they moved into his apartment, and he continued to pay for it. And Vincent went to live on the edge of town in a hut, a rickety hut, and he slept on straw. This is all true. So is the fact that the priests he worked for, when they found out what he was doing, they dismissed him. They fired him for, and I quote, undermining the dignity of the priesthood. Undermining the dignity of the priesthood. Now, I didn't grow up going to church. As I said, I started going when I was 15, and when I was 16, I gave my life to Christ. But I vividly remember the first few sermons that I saw, sitting in a pew like you are now. And the pastor, they would get up and they would rise to the stage, bathed in light. And they'd move up, and they'd disappear behind the podium. They'd disappear above the podium, as if they themselves were being elevated and exalted to share some powerful truths about God. That was a huge image for me. That was an image that seared itself into my mind about what ministry was and who could do it. For me, ministry was something that happened up there. This is where ministry was, up here. And the rest of us, at least me, were down here. So literally for me, and in so many ways, ministry was on a pedestal. And for someone as lowly and awkward and broken as I had no right to think, in my mind, of ever trying to do ministry. For me to do ministry, in the state I was in, I would be, for lack of a better phrase, undermining the dignity of the priesthood. One of the first few sermons I heard was the story of Moses. And I had heard that there was a character named Moses who existed and had a beard and freed the slaves and all that jazz. But I remember distinctly the first time I heard the story of Moses, I was blown away. Especially by one part, Exodus 4:10. And it's after God has revealed to Moses his plan for him and for saving the Jews. And Moses is less than thrilled. And he starts giving God all the reasons he shouldn't do it. And Moses says, Lord, I have never been eloquent. I am slow of speech and tongue, and that he always has been, and even after talking to God, that hasn't changed. Side note, after hearing that about Moses, I've always thought it was hilarious that when the time came to tell the film version of the story of Moses in Exodus, who do they choose for the inarticulate, ineloquent savior of a people? This guy! Charlton Heston! Or as you might remember, there it is. That's right. Originally I had a line in here about, guns don't kill people. Apes with guns kill people. But I cut it out. I decided not to use it. Where was I? Lord, I've never been eloquent. Right. But he says, Moses says, Lord, I've never been eloquent. I'm slow of speech and tongue. And I remember hearing that and being blown away by it because I identified with it so much. That was my story. And I tell people that sometimes and they think I'm being modest or they think I'm crazy or what have you. But for me, that is a fundamental truth of my life, especially then. For me, there might not be anything scarier for me than speaking. I fear conversations the way some people fear getting murdered or a plane crash or a roller coaster or something like that. And there are many reasons for that. But one thing since coming to Warner, especially in the last year, I've learned to be open about 3 dominant factors in my life. Anxiety, depression, and post-traumatic stress disorder. An unholy trinity of darkness and deception that is programmed in my brain, programmed to lie to me, to tell me that the world is darker and worse than it really is. It's only been in the last few years that I've even been able to put a name to these crazy puzzle pieces floating around my head. But back then, when I first started going to church, and for years after, I didn't know what was going on in my head. I just knew that somehow I was broken. And I knew someone broken like me, they shouldn't do ministry. So here's where I'll stop everything. Because spoilers, you're at Night of Stories. And I'm a ministry major. So obviously something changed. Somehow, hey, God came into his life and he overcame everything and you gotta go home and have a good night. Thanks. Yeah, and that happened. Like, changes happen, and God, like most people in the Bible who try running away from God, I did that. And like most people in the Bible who try running away from God, they find out, well, you can't really run away from God. And so God, yeah, spoilers indeed. The path that I took to get here, it wasn't a straight line. So much so that I don't think straight lines are even a real thing. I think that's a myth. But I want to share with you 2 moments in my life, 2 holy moments that led me here and that changed the way I saw everything. This is me and James. James is my best friend, my brother. And we met our first day of high school in Mr. Rouse's French class. And yeah, he's from California. And he was a cowboy. He looked like a cowboy and he talked like a surfer, which is an interesting combination. And he swam, he was on the swim team, he was on the football team, he knew how to talk to girls. And then there was me. Yeah. 300 pounds of sarcasm and pimple-ridden nerdiness. We were inseparable. We made quite the pair, and he made me a part of his family. And after my wife, he is the best friend I have ever had. James died of cancer on February 28th, 2014. Almost 13 months to the day before I decided to come to Warner. And just a month before his second daughter was born. In the weeks before he died, Nicole and I, we went to visit him at the VA hospital in Seattle. And I don't know if you've ever been to the VA hospital in Seattle, but you drive up to it, and it's this massive, windowless, gray, concrete monolith of a building, and it makes you wonder what sad Soviet architect had built this. When you get inside with so few windows, like, it's even bleaker. And as we go to visit him, he was staying in one of the rooms that my dad had stayed in when he had cancer before he died. So with that fact alone, in this windowless room of memories of misery, I was ready to hit the road. But I wanted to see my friend. And so Nicole and I, we stayed, and we just talked and joked and hung out. And after a while, James, he wanted to smoke. He was a smoker. God bless him. We're not perfect. And so we helped him out of his bed and into his wheelchair. And we all went downstairs to the first floor, into the back of the building. And it was cold, and it was raining, and it was just miserable outside. So we went into this ramshackled, tiny shack of a building called the Smoker's Hut. And we go in there, and there's six men sitting in there already. And they're all older gentlemen. They're all in wheelchairs. They're all sitting silently by themselves. And as we would come to find out, all of them didn't have much longer left to live. We sat down, even though my brain and that unholy trinity was telling me to flee as quickly as I could. And James started talking. Now James, to his credit, is the opposite of me. He could make anything, the most boring thing, he could talk endlessly about it and make it fun and interesting. And he was a spark that got everything going that night. And so he just starts talking, and before we know it, we're all talking to each other. I don't know if there's anywhere else in my life that I would have rather have been, or throughout my life, I don't know if there's another place I'd rather be. That moment was perfect. We just talked, and we inhaled the smoke and shot the breeze and just talked and told stories. And there aren't words for that moment. It was a holy moment. There was nowhere else I would have rather been than with those, what started out as strangers, and just hung out with. We stayed for over 4 hours, till after 2 a.m, just talking and making each other laugh and pondering the complexities of the universe and telling a story about how I kicked down a bathroom door in Mississippi one time and other better things. I remember being so enthralled in that moment, and I had this feeling come over me that can only be described as a rage and also a beautiful peace. And I felt this feeling whisper to me, and it said, this is what matters. This is what matters to me, and this is what I am meant to do. That was the second time I've ever felt that. The first time was just a few months before. A few months before James and the Smoker's Shack. Nicole had a friend in high school named Keegan. Keegan with a G. And a few years after high school, Keegan killed himself. And I remember the day of the funeral. It was in a church probably 5 times the size of this room, in their chapel, in their sanctuary. And it was packed. There were no seats left. There was barely any standing room left. But the place was filled with friends, with people who loved him, with families, teachers, friends who had graduated, friends who were still in high school, people who loved Keegan. And if I had to guess, I would assume that most of these people, the only time they'd ever enter into a church was for a wedding or a funeral. And I remember the priest getting up in his robes and going to the podium, and he started to eulogize Keegan. Only he forgot his name. Not only did he forget his name, he said the wrong name. He said Keenan with an N. Simple mistake, 1 letter. But just showed how this man, this shepherd, this minister, he never bothered to get to know Keegan while he was alive. He never bothered to love him enough to know his name while he was alive, not even in death. When there was a room full of people who knew him and loved him, who were there to honor him. I remember him just saying that wrong name maybe 12, 13, who knows how many times, and my fist being clenched. And that was that first time that I had that feeling, that rage, then that burning rage, and that peace, that sense of this is what matters. And I realized that whatever fallacies I had about ministry at the time, whatever brokenness I had in me, that at the very least, I could love better than that guy. At the very least, I could love more than I thought I could. I tell you all this, I tell you these stories because from Vincent van Gogh and Batman to James and Keegan and everything in between, because one, That's how my mind works. It's bouncing from story to story. But also because these stories have woven together and have taught me that there is indeed a God of love behind all things who loves us so much and wants us to love others the way that God loves us. Somewhere in there is actually a pretty good definition of ministry. I've also learned that ministry can't be on a pedestal. If it is, it isn't ministry. Now, to be clear, there's nothing wrong with holding teachers and leaders to a higher standard, amen. And this itself, glad I made it through that alive. And this itself, this isn't inherently bad. This isn't inherently evil. This can be a powerful tool. This can change lives. I've seen it. I've experienced it. And this can be a good. I love this. I love telling stories. I love it. I think God delights when I do it. I love it in the most deepest of levels where wet, beating flesh turns into soul. I love it. But if up here is where stories are told, down here is where stories are made. And I don't want to miss any more of that than I already have. Not only am I going to